Welcome to Unexpected Points. I'm your host, Kevin Cole. And, the mission of this podcast is to talk to some of the best, some of the brightest, the smartest people out there. We're going to talk wide receivers today. And unfortunately, I already had Rich Rebar on the show last week, so we already got the best and the brightest. But we have JJ Zachariason here this week to fill the void. So thank you, JJ, for joining me.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think that I'm the best and the brightest. And if you had Rich on last week, then I'm definitely not. But I appreciate you having me on.
Well, I'll say that you were the first guest that I had going right into the fantasy season, and people were loving the 15 players that you put out there, and I think people are going to love this episode too, because the wide receiver class, it's definitely more compelling than the running back class this year. So if we're talking about rookie dynasty drafts, obviously you're weighing those against each other, what you're going to end up doing. Normally, I would think that I like to skew a little bit more towards running backs than some people do because of an early payoff that you can get from some of these guys. But this year, I'm not so certain about it. Well, how are you approaching maybe that dynamic of it before we get into the individual wide receivers?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that there's a big three at running back, with Najee, Etienne, and Javonte. And I think that you can make the argument that those three would be the top three outside of Ja'Marr Chase. So my rankings are Najee, Etienne, then Ja'Marr Chase, and then Javonte Williams. So yeah, I mean, I still am leaning running back with those guys, but I don't think there's anyone even remotely close at RB4 than compared to where you get to like with wide receiver 8-ish, right? So
Right.
To me, it's just going to be a very, very wide receiver heavy, non-super flex, especially rookie drafts. If it's a super flex rookie draft, it's actually a great year for that, obviously, because it's a great quarterback class, a lot of dual threat guys. So you're able you're going to be able to get very good wide receivers in like the early second round of your rookie draft because of that. But, in a standard, one quarterback league, to me, it's the big three running backs. I think Ja'Marr Chase is right there with them. And then there's just going to be a bunch of wide receivers drafted.
Yeah, there are going to be a ton this year. I don't know if it's particularly unique, but I do think there's this thing that at least has jumped out to me with slot wide receivers, some of these smaller guys where you don't really know whether they can play outside or not.
Yep.
And I think that's some of the question. Maybe it's a little bit more of a real football issue, but as we get into these guys, I was doing some research there and like replaceability and things like that. So I guess when we're talking about fantasy drafts versus a real NFL draft, I think that could be a question with some of these slot guys that may move them further down for the real NFL draft. Is there anything else you would look at and say, like, how would your board differ looking at these wide receivers? Any thematic things versus, fantasy versus what these teams should be looking at?
I think the slot dynamic is something that's incredibly important because we know that slot receivers are generally a little bit more replaceable in the NFL. And we know that it's a lot easier for, a player playing on the outside can generally play in the slot. A player playing in the slot can't generally play on the outside. So that caps their upside in some way. I think we saw that a lot with Juju Smith-Schuster during the free agency period. We can say, it was a rough season for off season for wide receivers in general for these free agents. And we can say that it was because of, the cap, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think what happened with Juju in particular is that teams know that he's a slot guy. Teams know that, ever since Antonio Brown left, he hasn't been as efficient and as effective. And he's been in the Steelers usage, his slot usage has just gone up year over year in the NFL because that's what he is. And then teams know that that's, generally a little bit more replaceable. Now, the interesting dynamic with that is someone, when you get into like either of the Moores, Elijah or Rondale Moore, for instance, where you would hope that if a team is going to use a first round pick on one of these guys, they are going to utilize them in more ways than just being a slot guy, right? Because they should generally know that being a slot guy is replaceable. So why would you want to spend a first round pick on that? But then we know that front offices aren't rational and they're drafting running backs in the first round anyway. So maybe it doesn't really matter. Maybe it doesn't mean anything. But I think that's the biggest thing that I've run into too, is that while I'm looking at this, when I first ran these guys through my model to start the offseason, because I usually start prospecting in like January, I was like, wow, this is actually a pretty good wide receiver class, because on paper and in my model, I don't separate them based on, their archetype and the specific wide receiver position that they play. On paper, you have guys like Jalen Darden and these guys who have insane production and they check all the right boxes. Some of these guys are early declares, the age adjusted production is great. And then you look at their size and you say to yourself, are they really going to be able to win on the outside at the NFL level? And there's just, I understand that we're seeing more and more smaller wide receivers sort of enter the league, but you still have to ask those questions. Those red flags are still there. And to me, that's been one of the more challenging things to tackle with this wide receiver class.
Yeah, yeah. I think when we're getting into that Jalen Darden sort of range, whether it's Dwayne Estridge, these guys who are a little bit later, maybe Shi Smith, like I'm a little bit less concerned about that because you're not really spending that much on them.
Yeah, right.
But
sure.
But when it comes to the Moores, yeah, that's definitely an issue. And with the NFL, I would lean on the side that like a little bit of hubris and overconfidence in some of these evaluators they'll say, you know what, I can turn this guy into X because I know what sort of traits there are. I mean, we see this a little bit. I'm going to throw some of my own PFF guys under the bus here because the PFF comp for Rondale Moore that they had was Steve Smith. And it's like, do we have any clue that he can do what Steve Smith does?
Right.
Who knows? Like Rondale Moore has basically like a running back, when he's playing there. So like to be able to project something like that, I don't know about. And I would just quickly looking at some of the slot stuff. So we talk about replaceability, right? So if you want to have these guys are uber athletes, but then you look at I looked at guys who had the most yardage out of the slot the last 3 years in the NFL. Your top guys, Tyler Boyd, Cole Beasley, Cooper Kupp, Juju Smith-Schuster, who we mentioned. Now, Tyreek Hill and Tyler Lockett are up there. So those guys are pretty good athletes, but they can move around a bit. And then you go down further, Jarvis Landry, Julian Edelman, you got those types of names on there. You go even further, you have guys who missed time who also have been pretty good in the slot, like Adam Humphries. Replaceable, right? So that's the thing, is you can put somebody into that slot and get that type of yardage. So if you're forced to put your first round pick there, it's kind of limiting a little bit what you're doing around it. So I think that's going to be an interesting dynamic just to see where these guys end up falling. And maybe from a fantasy perspective, I mean, you could probably get, especially in PPR, to a very high-end outcome on some of these slot wide receivers. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, maybe if you're leaning between a Terrace Marshall or someone like that, you might say maybe he could be like the true wide receiver one of the class a little bit more than Elijah Moore could be.
Yeah, well, especially pre-draft, right? I mean, post-draft, we at least know where a Rondale Moore and Elijah Moore are going to play. And if one of those guys goes to like Kansas City or something, then you're going to feel more confident in what those guys are and what they're going to be able to provide. But, pre-draft, I think it's just a safer route to go with someone who is going to be playing on the outside more and who isn't going to be as team dependent. I mean, if you look at slot receivers who have been successful in fantasy football, they're generally going to be in high-powered offenses, in these high-volume offenses that, scheme them the right way. Whereas guys who play on the outside, they're not as dependent on that. It's not as important because they're winning by talent, right? They're winning because they're good, as opposed to just being at the right area of the field where you're going to be able to face easier defenders. So that to me is what's very difficult, is that after the draft is over, I do think that we're going to see we'll see a lot of rankings change with guys like both of the Moores, for instance. Like where I have the Moores ranked right now is probably lower than I will have them post draft. I'm just trying to play it safe because I don't know, how their teams are going to utilize them at the next level.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a whole lot of sense. So the conceit will be here. We'll go back and forth picking receivers as if this was, let's say, a dynasty rookie draft, but there's only wide receivers that we're choosing from. I mean, did you have any preference for whether you want to go first or second?
I have no preference.
Here?
No,
I didn't know if you had like a curveball. Do you have any curveballs up at the top, all the way at the top, or is it?
I mean, I kind of do. I mean, I think that there are a lot of guys that I can make the case for in the 2 to 7 spot. So I have I didn't just go chalk with like the Alabama wide receivers at 2 and 3. If that makes so. How about you start it off? You can go. You can go with
I think
obvious.
two is a lot more interesting than 1. So
yes.
So I mean, I will take, of course, Ja'Marr Chase here. And it's interesting about Chase because I think we're maybe getting backlash is the wrong term for it, but we're getting something where I think we're getting a little too complacent on how good he is. I feel like when I'm seeing some people critique him, I remember there was a statement, I think it was like one of these anonymous scout statements that said Ja'Marr Chase was the best prospect since Julio Jones, and there were people who were like, he's not on Julio Jones level, blah, blah. I mean, is he not the best prospect? He is like the best prospect since Julio Jones, right? Like, why are people incredulous of that statement? It seems very strange to me that you would be incredulous of a statement like that, because that seems like a very reasonable thing to say.
It does seem reasonable. I mean, to put it simply, with Ja'Marr Chase, it's like you have a guy who, as a sophomore, outperformed a junior Justin Jefferson, who went on in the NFL and had the most productive rookie season of all time at wide receiver. You know,
Yeah,
it's like
who's
what
head and
more?
shoulders above that strong 2020 class.
Yeah. And, a lot of people, I've gotten backlash for this take too. And like the way that I view this kind of stuff, but we get more. So, entering last year's draft, Jerry Jeudy, Henry Ruggs go ahead of Justin Jefferson in the draft. But we have more information now. We've seen Justin Jefferson be an incredible wide receiver. I think part of the reason why Justin Jefferson wasn't highly sought after or as highly sought after as he probably should have been is because of that slot role that he played during that Joe Burrow season, which we then saw Terrace Marshall play this past year, where people didn't know that he could win outside. They were cautious if whether or not he could, similar to what we were talking about, just a second ago. But if you looked at his season before that, his sophomore season, he was winning on the outside. It's just that he played that slot role then during his junior season. But we have more information now. We know that Justin Jefferson is a really, really good wide receiver. And we know now that Henry Ruggs likely is not, and that Jerry Jeudy is sort of this borderline. We don't know what he is yet. Right. And so I'm utilizing that information when I'm looking at these prospects. And so I'm going to look at Justin Jefferson and say, he balled out. And guess what? The guy who was a college season below him, who's now coming out this year, he outproduced that player. So of course, I'm going to look at him more favorably than I would someone like Devontae Smith or Jalen Waddle, who played with lesser competition. So, that's the thing with this LSU offense is that, we'll talk about Terrace Marshall in a second, but it's like, Terrace Marshall arguably played with wide receivers that are more talented and better than what he's going to play with in the NFL. I mean, I would say that that's probably the case, period. Right. Like that's it. And so, I think that we can't, I think we need to utilize that new information more than other people are. It's almost like, no, we only have the evaluations of these players once they get to the NFL. And then when they're in the NFL, we can't backtrack and look back at how good they actually are, but that's more seasons and more data for us to look at.
Yeah. I mean, you have to update. I mean, your prior is important, right? Going into the NFL draft, all that thing is important, but you have to recognize how much of a coin flip it is between these guys, who's better or who's worse, and especially when you had a bunching like you did in 2020 of all the different receivers, and one guy performs a lot better, he jumps straight up to the top. So yeah, I think it's fair to say that what we know today about Chase, maybe we're not going to necessarily place him as being like the best receiver who's come out over the last 4 years, but he's the best prospect, let's say, who's come out in a while there. And then you combine that with Jefferson, who has been the best receiver who's actually come out, and that's a pretty lethal combo. Yeah, I think with Chase too, I was just looking at this in some comp pieces here. I mean, he's not the quibble with him would be he is, a little bit over 6 feet tall. He weighed in at 201. If you look at his tape, we're gonna do some tape here. Warning, trigger warning. We're do some tape here. He won a lot. Like it made me feel worse about Burrow, honestly, while watching some of his tape because this dude was just like winning jump balls left and right and just muscling dudes. So maybe you could say there's some concern about his ability to do that at that sort of size. But it's everything is sufficient for me. I think it would be overlooking the importance of those type of attributes. And I also think, he's doing all this as a true sophomore. And when I was comparing him to some other comps that I had for him, like Odell Beckham Jr. or Justin Blackmon is the comp in our PFF guide. I mean, in the age equivalent season for Justin Blackmon, which was his redshirt freshman season, he had like 200 yards receiving.
Yep.
Odell Beckham had 700 yards. Now he had a big share because that offense was so much down, but it's just like not even close to being on the same level as what Chase did. And one other thing about market shares, which I look at a lot for here, in an offense like that, that's so productive, and you mentioned Justin Jefferson being there and Marshall being there, it's just really hard to get one of these bonkers market share numbers. You can't, you have to get like 2,500 yards receiving or something to have one of these insane market share numbers. So his market share is even more impressive than what it looks like if you're looking at it vis-a-vis someone else who's in a more of a normal offense.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. I always look at with teammate score, however you want to look at teammates. I just have like a random score in my model, but with teammate score, it's more about the floor than the ceiling, right? It's more about the fact that like Henry Ruggs, for instance, coming out last year, he didn't have a floor. His stat score in my model was horrific because he didn't produce in college, right? And so that's different than someone like even Jalen Waddle is better than Henry Ruggs from a statistical standpoint. But we know that targets are earned. We know that players who are good are getting targets. And so if they're good enough, then they should at least see some sort of floor. It's the ceiling where if you have good, proven teammates, or at least at the time of analysis, guys who we think are good, you can at least make that excuse to some degree. But it's the excuse when it goes to the to the Henry Ruggs level where it's, oh no, he had great teammates. Well, no, he didn't produce at all. Like it wasn't just like, oh, he didn't have this like stealing production. It was that the floor wasn't there either.
Yeah, yeah, and the competition angle of looking at the cornerbacks, which is something that probably boosts up Chase. I'm a little bit less like worried
Same.
about that
Yeah.
that sort of stuff. I mean, who knows? These guys could all bust in the NFL, all these cornerbacks too. And it's really the competition within your other wide receivers that's more important to
Yep.
the dynamic for how these guys put up production. So that's the default choice here. I'll give you. I'll see the floor to you now for the second pick.
So I have Rashad Bateman as my wide receiver too.
All right, that's spicy.
Yeah, so there's definitely some concern about the fact that we all thought that he was like 210 and he weighed in at 190. Like that's not just like he lost like
well,
5 or 10
he was
pounds.
also 6 foot when he was 6'2", so he was just like
he's just like a smaller
like
person than we thought.
Honey,
Yeah.
I Shrunk the Kid sort of situation here. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so he did have that COVID issue, in the fall, and he did say that definitely gave him some problems, and that could be part of the reason why he didn't weigh as much. But the one thing I will say, what would be worse is if you have a weigh-in that, and I don't have athleticism metrics really in my models that much. I have some thresholds for running backs to hit, mostly from a speed score standpoint. And then at wide receiver, I just have height and weight. So there's no athleticism testing at all on my wide receiver model. It's all production based and, teammate score stuff, et cetera. But with Rashad Bateman, I look at this stuff subjectively. Like my model is not how my rankings are necessarily. But with Rashad Bateman, the good thing about him is that he was smaller in frame, but he also ran faster than I thought a lot of people thought that he would. So he tested better for his size, which is, good to see that it wasn't necessarily like, oh, he's just small. Oh, he's also unathletic, which we've seen at times, like a Tylan Wallace, for instance, who's explosive, didn't test very well. So that's a little bit of a concern. But with Rashad Bateman, he tested well. So I'm not as concerned about his smaller size. And there's still good comps, I think, overall for Bateman, despite that size. I mean, I think his top comp is like a Keenan Allen, obviously a higher end comp, but he's a great route runner. And then, across the board, again, I go back to, there's a lot of size and the role that these wide receivers are going to play type question marks with these wide receivers from like 2 to 7. And I don't think that those question marks are as strong for Rashad Bateman as they are for some of these other wide receivers. So from a pre-draft standpoint, that's why I have him at wide receiver too. But I think that if some of these other players fall into the right spot, objectively the right spot, if they go to a Kansas City or something like that, then that's when we can see them jump someone like Bateman. But right now, I just think he's a very safe prospect. Look at his breakout age. One of the main metrics I look at in my model is yards per team pass attempt. He's strong there. And then I use that in conjunction with receptions per game. He's strong there. I mean, he's great. He's a great prospect. So that's why I have him at wide receiver too.
Okay, so the big question is going to be, or if someone's going to push back against this, you're going to say draft position, right? So you're looking at these guys here. I mean, I'll pull up the most recent numbers. If anyone's I used the grinding the mocks. If anyone's seen this, I use this a lot in my analysis where it is compiling a bunch of different mock drafts, thousands of them at this point, believe it or not, to come up with an expected draft position for these guys. So as of now, and some of this data goes back a little bit far, so I think there are directional things going on here. But as of now, it has Ja'Marr Chase ranked at number 4. I think that's a little aggressive. I don't think he's going to go in the top 4. But Devontae Smith at 8, Jalen Waddle 10, Kadarius Toney 24. And there's a bit of a little flip up here, a directional flip up. If you look at Terrace Marshall is really switched spots here with Rashad Bateman. He's on the rise. Bateman is, I don't want to say he's falling, but I think he may be flatlining a little bit here. So Marshall 31 and then Bateman 34. So being that he is number 6 here on this list, does that concern you?
I mean, to a degree, yeah. I mean, I'll input draft capital into my model because the way that I built the model is I wanted to be better than draft capital, right? So I used draft
Right.
capital as the baseline, and then I, inputted these different categories, and then I just saw how that changed and the difference there. So draft capital is part of this. So if I plug that in, I'm sure that Devontae Smith after the fact is going to look better. I think he might even look better than Bateman right now in the model. It's just
Yeah,
that
yeah.
there are some more subjective questions that I have. But yeah, I mean, I think that it's some concern. The one thing that I would say is that, if one of these wide receivers, granted it's not Baltimore, but if one of these wide receivers goes later in the first, you're falling to a better, stronger situation at quarterback more than likely. And that to me is still somewhat of a plus. But I think that it obviously just depends at the end of the day, like where they're landing, what that spot actually is. If Rashad Bateman falls out of the first, then I'm going to be more concerned. Yes. But if he's still like a late first round pick, I'm going to be less concerned. I think that you could still make that argument that he's the wide receiver too. And that's with the assumption, a lot of these rankings that I did, it's with the assumption that, Devontae Smith's going to be a top 10 pick and that Jalen Waddle will be like a top 15 pick.
Yeah. Okay. I agree with all that. Now, I think when we talk about the slot again, and especially when we talk about Jefferson, what happened with him, we'll see this with Marshall a bit. I notice a lot with these top prospects, and I think this is when measurables become somewhat important, and looking beyond what happened the last season becomes important here. Because I saw this with a ton of guys, and Bateman's one of those guys where. Especially as some more senior receivers, like in the case here, Tyler Johnson, who really fits in the slot, left out. That a lot of college offenses are just putting their best guy in the slot,
Yeah.
even if he wouldn't traditionally be that type of receiver, because they don't necessarily have three different great receivers to throw out there and want to parcel out those roles. They do a lot of. I don't know about Minnesota specifically, but a lot of teams are doing like a lot of quick game, a lot of RPOs, a lot of other stuff where you want to use the guys out of the slot. So if you look at his slot percentage, he was productive as a freshman, so it was only 7% as a freshman. Plus, I think these guys don't know what they're doing. They just like throw him on the outside, and they just like you're just like someone has to guard you out there, and that's your role for these college receivers. So it's like 7%, and then he was at 13% as a sophomore, and then he was up above 60% last year. And I think you'll see this with a lot of different guys. But again, is a little bit different than the Moores. I wouldn't use Justin Jefferson's success to say Elijah Moore can play outside. You have to kind of look at these other factors too.
Yeah, and at least he has experience playing on the outside, right? Like,
Right.
So, again, some of the Moores just like don't. Like
Yeah.
Rondell and Elijah really don't have that experience, whereas at least you can latch onto that with some of these other prospects.
Yeah, and then the other dynamic is a lot of these guys had their depth of target go way down when they really went into these roles, but yet their per route run efficiency was roughly the same, and so they're getting a lot more targets. They're able to feed them more often. They're just as efficient, but they're kind of playing a different role. And I think all of that versatility is going to be fine at the next level. So no concerns there. Okay, so this is a tough one for me because I got a little suckered last year, falling for what it should have been. It should have been going with Justin Jefferson, right? So I was like, but then I started doing a little tape again. So I was doing a little too much tape watching here, and then I started looking at Rager, and I started to like him a lot. Now I don't think the same thing is here with Waddle and with Devontae Smith, but I don't know. Like the more I'm hearing about things, the more I'm thinking I'm going to go Waddle here, despite the fact that. Like I probably should have like a system built in that would prevent a human being from making these types of decisions, if that makes sense. But what I will say about him is, you mentioned that the Ruggs thing, and I think people can bring that up. I think it's really not the same, in my opinion, for a few different reasons. I mean, he was pretty productive as a freshman, and I think sometimes when it comes to receiving competition, I mean, we mentioned LSU, right? So you have the two really great receivers. Now, but even if you're playing against two really great receivers, you still get on the field a lot because there are three wide receivers set. So generally, I think that sometimes that can be overplayed, that hand. But when you're literally playing on a team that has four different first-round receivers, things become a little bit difficult in that circumstance. And like, Ruggs suffered much more, in my opinion, because of that. He was much worse on these metrics. If you look at Waddle, especially what he was doing this year,
Yeah.
going the first handful of games before he got injured, he was averaging over 100 yards a game, pretty elite numbers for what he was doing. He was, I think, it was the SEC Freshman of the Year, so he was performing pretty well initially. He is an early declare, whereas DeVonta Smith is not, despite the fact that they're both the same age. So I think the age factor mitigates that a little bit, but there does seem to be a big signal, and other models have found this. I know Football Outsiders has a model where they do on the early declare, and what it's telling you is, and I think this will be an interesting question when we get to the DeVonta Smith thing. I hate it when people just out of hand discount these sorts of things about, well, maybe he likes college, maybe he wanted to go back.
Yes.
It's like,
I have so many takes on this topic. Yes, I agree.
It's just like, it's telling you something that Henry Ruggs leaves and becomes the first wide receiver drafted, and DeVonta Smith goes back to school. Like, he wasn't going to get drafted before, in that round. Maybe people say, oh, he had a second round grade. Second round grade's not great. Okay,
Right.
like, it's not a top 10 grade that we're talking about potentially here. So, like, a second round grade for a player who was more productive than the first player drafted, and was more productive even than the second player drafted, you have to start to wonder some of these things going on here. So that would be the red flag. And then, we can get more into, if you're going to take Smith next, the weight issues, the other things there, and how to frame it. And again, how annoyed I am by the people trying to discount all of these things, as if you should just throw them all out the window.
I'm gonna shock you with the next pick, by the way, but I'll talk about Jalen Waddle first. So we maybe we should just talk about Waddle and Smith combined here, just because it might be easier to do that. So with Waddle, the one thing that scares me is what happened during a sophomore year, and I feel like no one is answering that question well enough. And I think that's a concern, because he didn't play as many snaps as he did, the season before. And obviously the competition was there. Yeah. But you still have to ask that question, because that would have been, if he had a solid sophomore season, he would probably be the consensus wide receiver 2 in this class, because we wouldn't have to latch onto this small sample size and what he did this past season. Right. But I agree with you. I mean, I think that you could put Waddle here. I have Smith ahead of Waddle, but it's close. I mean, it's a coin flip for me, because you really can just look at red flags for both guys and start pinpointing things, et cetera, et cetera. I do think, one of the main reasons I wanted to put Waddle ahead of Smith was what you mentioned with the early declare stuff. My model has a lot of signal with that. And if you look back, since 2006, which is where the data goes back to with my model, there's been 53 wide receivers drafted in the first round. 13 of those 53 were not early declares. And then of those 13, only 5 of them were able to put one 1,000-yard season together. And only one of them, so one of the 13 non-early declares, had multiple 1,000-yard seasons. That was Dwayne Bowe. So you're looking at a really, really bad hit rate with these guys who weren't early declares. Now, I think that Brandon Ayuk is probably going to buck that trend, but he also was a JUCO transfer, so he didn't go through that usual process, of playing all 4 years at the same college. So that's one of the reasons why, DeVonta Smith, to me, there's that red flag there for him. And then, obviously the BMI stuff is still a thing. Do I think I'm certainly not someone who thinks that BMI is everything and that you avoid DeVonta Smith because of his BMI. But there's still some signal in my model with BMI. It still matters to some degree. It matters a lot more at running back, I've found, than it does at wide receiver. But the bottom line is, again, I go back to, we're looking at this pre-draft. Post-draft, we're going to have more information. We're going to feel better about landing spot, et cetera. And where we are sitting right now with DeVonta Smith is that we don't have any comp for DeVonta Smith, any reasonable, real comp for DeVonta Smith, because, if you go to like a Calvin Ridley, who I think is a reasonable comp for him, Calvin Ridley still had like 3 points in BMI more than DeVonta Smith does. And it's a really, really tough evaluation as a result of that. And I think it's okay to sit back, again, pre-draft, before we know these landing spots, throw up our arms and say, I don't really know. I don't exactly know how DeVonta Smith is going to translate, because we've never seen anything like this. And you and I both like to evaluate by looking at history and what we've seen from wide receivers in the past to help predict the future. And in a situation like DeVonta Smith, we just haven't seen this size and production combination. I lean more towards production, of course. That's what matters most to me at the wide receiver position. And there's a lot of good things about Smith's profile, but the non-early declare stuff and the BMI, they're both at least something, especially the non-early declare thing.
Yeah, that's okay. That, I mean, I mentioned that first because obviously I think that's a pretty huge deal. Just to go back really quickly for Waddle and the sophomore season thing. So
Yeah.
okay, so the stat that I find a lot of signal with, although it takes context, is looking at their career market share. Very often that has a bigger signal than even at their final season. Whereas with running backs, yeah, you don't really care what they're they were doing in the past. And okay, so my explanation for that, if I'm gonna like shoehorn a narrative into why that's the case, is because at running back, so much is a coaching decision,
Exactly.
whether or not someone's getting the ball or not. Whereas a wide receiver, when you have three of these guys out on the field almost all the time, if you're a good wide receiver, you should be on the field, and then you're out there and you have a chance to prove yourself. No matter what the coach is trying to do, yeah, they can scheme up plays for different directions. That's why it's important to look at screens. It's important to look at things like that where guys are getting scheme yards. But you at least have a chance. Now, I would say this Alabama situation, because of the fact that they have four different talented wide receivers, introduces the potential for a coach to make a bad decision. I guess is in lack of a better word. In particular, make a bad decision in favor of players with less eligibility left at that point. So if you look at those four guys, Waddle had the most eligibility left of them. So maybe there's something going on in that area. Two of them are going out and going to be entering the NFL draft that year. DeVonta Smith could have entered the NFL draft that year. So I'm not saying teams would really go into this sort of thing, but I'm just thinking about potential decisions in coin flip situations.
Yeah. Well, the other thing too, I think that's why, this is kind of on topic, but I think that's why draft capital matters more at running back than it does at wide receiver too. Because when a team and a coach is part of that evaluation process, obviously, but when a team takes a running back in the first or second round, they're going to be more inclined to give that running back work. And since we're only going to see one running back on the field usually at once, then that running back's going to be gobbling up that volume and being more productive in fantasy football. Whereas to your point, with wide receivers, you're going to have three of them on the field. If they're good and if they're talented and if they're getting open, they're going to get the ball, right? So wide receiver is much more talent driven. Therefore, draft capital, yes, it matters to some degree because good players are going to be drafted earlier generally, but it's not going to be as strong as what we see with running back because of that coaching element that's sort of embedded in what happens with, running backs getting the ball and being fantasy relevant.
Yeah, and I also think for Smith, it's just going to be. I'm really interested to see where he gets drafted because I don't know. Like, I don't know if there is a player amongst the big three, let's call them, of Waddle, Smith, and Chase. He would be the one I think mock drafters could be the most wrong about in a way because, like I said, because he didn't come out last year. Maybe there is something. He's getting some signal from the NFL that they're not as high on him. So if he slips into the middle, the late first round, as opposed to those other guys, that's going to make a big difference for me and how they're viewing him.
Yeah.
All right. So let's say who would be then your number 4, I guess, Ron here.
It would actually be my number 3 actually.
Okay.
So I have this guy above both Alabama wide receivers. It's Terrace Marshall.
Okay.
And
both. Okay. Oh yeah. Sorry, I forgot that I had Waddle in there already. Okay.
Yeah. So I have him over both Alabama wide receivers. So I think so. Number one, this is going to be the most like controversial thing that I probably say on the show with Marshall being the wide receiver 3 in this class. And I think though that a lot of people are using, and I already alluded to this, a lot of people are using the teammate factor as almost an excuse for like Waddle and Smith to a degree of, looking at their production and stuff. It at least has been an excuse historically for, whether it was Ruggs last year or what have you. But no one's really using that same excuse for Terrace Marshall. And then if you look at his overall, his overall career at LSU, so freshman year, he has whatever, it's freshman year, and you can't expect much from a wide receiver as a freshman. Sophomore year, though, if you look at what he did up until that point, I think they were playing Vanderbilt. He missed part of the 4th game for LSU that season. That was the Joe Burrow season. He was producing really well, and he broke his foot in that game, and he missed like 4 or 5 weeks after that. Up until that point, He had more touchdowns than Justin Jefferson. I think he only had one fewer reception. Now, Jamar Chase missed one of the first 4 games, so his sample size isn't completely comparable. But even then, Jamar Chase was obviously dominating, but he wasn't just like going he wasn't producing so much more than Terrace Marshall was up into that point. And so you can at least look at that and say, oh, when he was healthy, he was competing with these 2 other insanely good prospects, right? And then, he comes back later in the season. Who knows how healthy he was? But regardless, that's at least a plus. And then you look at what he did this past year, where they threw him in that Justin Jefferson slot role. And he played 7 of 10 games because he opted out early. In those 7 games, he had great market share numbers. I mean, he had 28% of LSU's receptions. He had 33% of the team's yards. He had 59% of the team's touchdowns. Terrace Marshall, if he would have played the full 10 games, because I know a lot of models in the fantasy football world looks at full season numbers. And so they see Terrace Marshall not looking great within their model necessarily, because he only played, his best season was 70% of the actual season. So season long numbers don't look as good, but in context, they look amazing. They look great. And then on top of that, he is an early declare. He's one of the few wide receivers in this class who has true alpha size. And then, there's been there was a great stat from PFF, at least from the Twitter account that they tweeted out. He had a perfect passer rating in college when his quarterbacks were throwing his way when he was lined up on the outside. So he played on the outside in college. He had a perfect quarterback rating when he was on the outside, and then he plays in the slot his final year. So he clearly can move all over the field. I don't know what I'm missing here. Like I look at Marshall, and I know that there's plenty of film concerns that some people have said that he looks lazy and that he's not, as aggressive as he could be and all that, but he literally checks every single box analytically. And I'm kind of surprised that he's not getting as much love as I think he should throughout the fantasy football world.
Yeah, I mean, I think LSU was god awful, right? So that's part of it. Wide receiver wins. Maybe coming into this equation. Yeah, a little bit inventing a whole new thing here. And okay, so here's the one thing that I'll say, and I've been struggling with this a bit, especially because it's all over the place with different receivers and what's happened in this year. Now, Marshall isn't as bad as some others, but we're talking about a season where he had 7 games played. So he was playing at this level, right? So he was playing at this first round wide receiver type of level. So he had let me look here. He had a 23% target share this year. He jumped up to almost 2.9 yards per route run. Now, but if you look at the last 2 years, I mean, he was 14% target share, 6 before that. It was 1.6 yards per route run before. Now, he had all the competitive issues we talked about. So those cleared up and his numbers went up, which makes sense. But we still only have these 7 games to base upon because we don't have prior seasons. And how do you look at that versus the equivalent numbers if you're looking at someone who played 12, 13 games, something like that? Would that change your analysis at all? Or your confidence in that analysis and what we saw, the reality of it or not? I mean, I haven't looked specifically at Marshall's numbers, but I think he played pretty well across the board. But the fewer games you have, the more you can get these spike game influences on things.
Yeah, for sure. And that's one of the reasons. So I get this question a lot because my model looks at full season numbers, and someone's like, well, why wouldn't you look at per game numbers? And the problem is that you could get a Jalen Waddle season, right, where you have 4 games of him not being hurt. And you could how do we know that Jalen Waddle would have kept that up? Of course we can say, Jalen Waddle would have won the Heisman if he didn't get hurt, and would have been Devontae Smith. We can say that, but we have to work with the information that we do have. And at least within the context of what, Marshall did, obviously 7, if we were to compare it apples to apples with Jalen Waddle, 7 games is significantly more than the 4 that Waddle played. And then if you look at the career trajectory of Terrace Marshall, it's not that unlike, if anything, I feel a little bit more confident in it, right? Because he did get better every season, whereas Waddle, we talked through it and we understand why it would be the case, but Waddle did have that sophomore season that was just not as strong. And so there were some question marks there as to why that happened. So that's part of the reason why I just feel a little bit more confident in Marshall, not only because of the size either. I mean, that's just another plus to his profile. Now, would I like it if he had 13 games played this past year instead of 7, or if he had played the full 10 that LSU played? Of course. But, I think with a lot of this and with prospecting in general, you're going to run into situations where the sample sizes aren't necessarily, super ideal. And so you're sort of using, what I don't want to call them excuses because I think that they're rational, right? Like rational excuses. Like the Henry Ruggs thing is just such an easy example because I don't think that those excuses were rational at all. Whereas with Marshall, he's at least hitting a baseline from a statistical standpoint. Like in my model, he doesn't have a negative stat score, right? He still has a positive, he's still above average with his overall stat score. Whereas if he had a negative one, first rounders that have negative stat scores in my model at wide receiver, literally all of them have been busts, right? And so I wouldn't feel as confident in Marshall, but I do just given the context of everything.
Yeah. For Ruggs, I think do dunk mixtapes get part are they a big part of the rational model there? Because I think that may have boosted him up some boards. And what other piece of context that we talked about the receivers here? And maybe I'll just go ahead and say, since no one, I guess officially Devontae Smith is still on the board in our little thing here. So I'll go ahead and say I'm going to take Devontae Smith next. We kind of already wore out talking about him. But I will say when we're looking at these guys, and I think these are for me like the 5 guys where it sounds silly to say like, oh, I wouldn't be surprised if any of them were the wide receiver one, but it really kind of fits in this sort of mold, and that's how we should think about it. Clearly, there is a right choice. So this is another thing I want to talk about here when we talk about like the BMI discussions, the other things, this and that. It's not like this is a real thing does not mean this guy has no chance of success. It does not mean if someone busts, and you see different stats for, these guys are all busts that had X thing. You're not a guaranteed bust. We're just like tilting the odds in one direction or another. Sure. So you can say this guy is 100% the right choice and also say there's an extremely high chance that someone else will be better than him. These 2 things can kind of go together. And I think that goes with a lot of your ordering for these type of guys. And I'll say, again, we had the early declare thing. So Smith being the only one of this group who is not an early declare, but in the age category, Waddle is about a full year older than these other guys. So that's another piece of context to put together there. So let's go through Smith. We'll take him off of here, and I think this is probably one of the more interesting parts of the draft right here. I'll throw it out to you for the next pick, which I guess would be number 6 here.
Yeah, and so you brought up that you saw that big 5 wide receivers, if you will, from a rookie draft standpoint. I agree because this is where I sort of have a tier break pre-draft, and it goes back to the slot discussion that we had earlier. I have Elijah Moore here, so I'm going to go with Elijah Moore. It's really hard to find a better production profile than Elijah Moore's in this class. He had over 36% of Mississippi's receptions in each of his last 2 seasons. That was as a sophomore and a junior, so he's an early declare. He averaged almost 11 receptions per game, which is part of my model, but receptions per game in and of itself is pretty irrelevant. It's just that it's in conjunction with yards per team attempt, which I think kind of makes sense because you're looking at sort of yards per team attempt is one of those metrics. It's like a market share / efficiency one where players who are getting down the field and gaining chunk yards are going to benefit from that. But at the same time, you need to get enough volume to look good in yards per team attempt. But I think that in conjunction with receptions per game is why it works. But he had 11 receptions.
It's kind of like yards per route run in a way. I mean, I use that. I use that on guys we don't have data for going in the past as a proxy for that.
Yeah, exactly. And so, he averaged almost 11 receptions per game last season. His yards per team pass attempt rate amongst the quote combine invites this year, even though they didn't have the combine, they still had that list. That was 8th best in the class. 54.5% touchdown share was 4th best. I mean, basically what I'm saying is he was insanely productive. The main problem goes back to what we talked about earlier is he going to be more than a slot guy at the next level? He's only 5'9", he's like 180 pounds. But he does play sort of with that like chip on his shoulder when you watch him. He's got like that Steve Smith type toughness to his game. And then if you look at comps, like one of the top comps for him was Tyler Lockett. So there's like that, at least that like trajectory of an insanely productive wide receiver in college who has that smaller frame, who went from being more of a slot guy at the start of his career to then developing into something more. And I think that you can see that with Elijah Moore just because he was that productive and that good in college, whereas you might not feel as confident with someone else who played the slot so much. I mean, I think PFF was talking about how Elijah Moore didn't even play. He had like 35 snaps against press this past year or something like that, like something insane. I mean, like that tells you something, right? That tells you that they didn't trust Elijah Moore to just beat his defender one-on-one at the line. And so, there's some concern there, but the production profile is just crazy. And if he does end up getting decent capital, if he does go in the late first, I think he's going to be a pretty good fantasy asset.
Yeah, no, I'm totally in agreement. Yeah, he would have been my next pick here. There's just too much to like here. I mean, I had Lockett as being the comp two. I saw previously discussed Rich Rebar threw Brandon Cooks out there as a potential guy, as someone who played a decent amount in the slot and then went in and out. Another friend of the pod, Matthew Freeman, tried to like make some peripheral stat argument. Like I don't care how many kick return yards he has, quite honestly. I mean, it's nice, right? It's nice, but Tyler versus Tyler Lockett having a lot more. But Tyler Lockett
Yeah.
was not. He was not an early declare. He had played like 50% more games, so I think that's part of
Right.
it too. I mean, he has the speed, right? So he's got the speed. He's got the athleticism that we talked about there. He has the Devil's three cone, which I always like, the 666 on the three cone, and then I guess he played 80% of his snaps in the slot. I'm looking the last year, so maybe there's some hint there. And it's just difficult to figure out like who else you're going to throw into this
That's what I'm
slot,
saying.
right?
Exactly. Yeah. Right.
Maybe you could like, if you really were just anti short dudes, you could try to, but then you'd just be severely reaching at this point to go with someone else. It seems like if you really said, you know what, I really like Rondale Moore, or I really like Kadarius Toney. Like those guys aren't profiling as guys who are necessarily going to be better at the NFL level. If anything, the offensive weapon has been more of a boondoggle for
Yep.
teams than the slot receiver has been. So it all makes sense to me. Okay, so now with that being said, yeah, so this is a tough one here. So with that being said, I think I am going to go with Rondale Moore here, even though I'm not in love with it. Just a massive freshman season, right? And the concern may be some of the injury issues that he had, which limited a lot of play after that. The height, according to Jim Nagy of the Senior Bowl fame, he's being put into the backfield in some places. I don't know if I buy that, but I guess at 5'7" is a little bit smaller than what some people would like. I mean, he's pretty thick.
Mhm.
Hashtag thick. So that hopefully will help him going forward to the next level. And again, if we're talking about players who are going to be very landing spot dependent, like he's probably going to go right up to the top of your list. So the thought would be at this point, I would still go with Moore here, even though the bottom could drop out a bit if he's not going to be used correctly. And I put him as like thick Tavon Austin would be my comp for him versus what, like I said, some people at PFF have had for him, putting him as a Steve Smith. I just need to see it before I'm going to do something like that. And the hope would be that even someone like Tavon Austin could have been more successful if they knew what to do with him. And that's kind of the hope here, is when you say Tavon Austin, you don't want that to be like, it's the worst thing ever
Yeah.
possible here. You're just saying, as a guy who was probably overdrafted, again, one of these not early declares that we talked about before too, which I think there's probably something to that. And the hope, the ability was Moore can maybe do a little bit better in that sort of versatile role.
Yeah, I think that I have Rondale Moore here as well. And I, the interesting thing is that my model takes the best season for each of these production metrics, and they're all from his freshman season, which you
Right,
just
yeah.
never, you just never see that. I mean, look, pre-draft, there's just so many question marks around Rondale Moore's profile because he's been hurt the last couple of years, and we haven't seen him, give us a full season since that freshman year. So we just don't know all that much. I think from a comp standpoint, the more of the ceiling comp that I have for him is like, because again, he's like Devontae Smith, where it's really difficult to find a good comp for him because he's just so small, and we just haven't seen that combination with like the freshman year production and stuff. So I went more of like what could we see him do at the NFL level as a ceiling? And I think the combination of T.Y. Hilton and Curtis Samuel makes sense for Rondale Moore. And maybe honestly, it could be Curtis Samuel in 2019 and how they utilize him in Carolina. Maybe that's what Rondale Moore ends up becoming, where he can and will line up in the backfield sometimes, but they use him in more of that vertical threat role that season before Joe Brady came to town this past year, and they sort of went back to what we thought Curtis Samuel would do at the NFL level. But yeah, I mean, I think that Moore at least has that kind of upside and potential because of what we saw with his age-adjusted production and when he was a freshman. But I just think he's a highly volatile prospect. You run the risk that, yes, he's a Tavon Austin type where he's more gadgety and teams don't really know how to utilize him. And I think at the very least, he's probably going to play some sort of slot role to start. But I have more confidence in Elijah Moore moving to the outside right now than I do Rondale Moore.
Yeah, I mean, another name that you could throw out there, but the height in particular doesn't work so well, and the weight isn't great here. Also, but just from a role perspective, I mean, maybe you want to look at a more like a Tavon Austin type that was kind of successful, as maybe someone like a Percy Harvin. Again, it's like a
Yeah.
successful type of guy that you're going to
Yep.
use in that role. But again, the body type doesn't really work, so they may not show up together in some in comps. But that's another person, at least role wise, that could fit in there. All right, who we got next?
I'm gonna go with Tylan Wallace next.
Okay.
And this is another tier break for me. So after Rondale, after the Moores, they're kind of in their own tier for me. And then you get into this giant tier 4. But you have Tylan Wallace. In my model, 11 wide receivers were able to have a 3.0 yards per team pass attempt max season or better. Tylan Wallace was one of those players. Then if you filter those guys out by a breakout age that was under 20, and that's with a 20% dominator, he's in good company because it's Rashad Bateman, Elijah Moore. You have Tutu Atwell, who, I mean, if Tutu were to be, not 155 pounds, maybe people would care about him a little bit more. Aside from Mel Kiper, who seems to love him. And then Isaiah McCoy, who I think is actually a decent sleeper just in general. But, you look at McCoy, he came from Kent State, so he's a smaller school guy. He's not going to get that much love. And then Tutu has, the really small size. So it's really Rashad Bateman and Elijah Moore, that are matched with those two filters with Tylan Wallace, which is good to see. His production is not really the issue, is the bottom line. He saw a lot of production at Oklahoma State. To me, it's what I talked about earlier. I referenced earlier where he plays with a lot of like explosiveness to his game, but then he didn't test well, which is somewhat of a concern. How is this going to translate to the next level? He doesn't have ideal size necessarily, and he's not an early declare either. So that's another semi issue, at least analytically, with him. So I think he's solid. I think he should be fine. But I just don't think that he's in that upper. Some people have had him in that sort of upper tier, like in that like first round of or mid first round of rookie drafts. But I don't necessarily see it. I think late first round. I think he's more of an early second round pick.
Yeah, I mean, the question here is, and again, I haven't this one I have not ground up the film on to really see. Although I probably did watch a Just Bombs highlight reel of Tylan Wallace at one point in time. But the word on the street is that this ACL injury really affected his game. Maybe
Right.
that has something to do with the testing. And if you're into genetics on here, his twin brother had 3 ACL tears, if you believe that. So that's,
Man.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if hereditary.com or one of these things is not looking good on the ACL tear issue there. So I think I would also go with Wallace here because it has that upside. But we're starting to get into the thing of like what he is. We're getting into like potential flame out territory, I think, for some of these guys at the NFL level. And when it comes to the early declare thing, I have not tested this, so this is just more my opinion than anything. I think as you get further down into the late second, third round, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, it
as
matters
much.
less. Yeah, definitely.
It's really more of a first round type of issue there. And if anything, sometimes the guys who are early declaring and then coming out late is like a little bit problematic. It's like, why are you doing that? If you're going to be like a third round pick or something like, or a fourth round pick or whatever it is, why are you coming out early? There may be some red flags somewhere else that's holding them down. So, so I like Wallace there. Let me see. So next, I don't know. I mean, I guess I'll go with Kadarius Toney just because I'm just going to go with draft capital. I'm going to try to say like, I'm going to try to, I mean, I'm like, I hate offensive weapons. I'm like Mr. Anti-offensive weapon. I was kind of anti Curtis Samuel and Paris Campbell when they were coming out to some people, but I don't know. Like, I think he is probably going to be drafted in the late second round. I mean, the late first round, early second round, probably. So if that ends up being the case, again, I'm going to hope that you can use him. It's just like I'm just like way less confident the way that I watched him playing with his measures, even versus someone like Rondale Moore. It's even more of a question mark for me. So again, this is almost entirely a draft position dart throw in opposition to some of the other names. Now, I'll let you pick the next name. Maybe we can talk about why in opposition to who you may have chosen. But at this point, I just can't pass that up versus guys who were legitimately talking about being like third-round wide receivers.
Yeah, I think it's fair. I have one guy that I would squeeze in between them. The one thing I want to add with Kadarius Toney. So again, I have a stat score that my model produces based on the production metrics and some other stuff. And I'll just read you the first round wide receivers since 2006 that have had a negative stat score. Okay, right. And Kadarius Toney fits that bill.
Right.
And not only that, but Kadarius Toney is not an early declare either. So there's just an insane amount of red flags. Like let's be honest, if there's one first round wide receiver that has bust written all over him, it's definitely Kadarius Toney.
Oh,
Like
100%.
it's absolutely Kadarius Toney. So it's Brashad Perriman, Philip Dorsett, Kelvin Benjamin, Cordero Patterson, Darius Hayward-Bay, Ted Ginn, Craig Davis, Anthony Gonzalez, and Henry Ruggs. Those are the negative stat scores that have been drafted in the first round since 2006. So Toney is not in good company. If he goes in the first, I'm sure people are going to look at him from an ADP standpoint. That ADP is probably going to rise a little bit. Right now, I think it's fair enough because of the fact that his production profile is lacking so much. But the fantasy football world generally is analytically and numbers driven. So we see that reflected in ADP more than what we would see in like a normal NFL draft type world. But yeah, so that to me, I mean, there's just a lot of bad marks on Kadarius Toney's profile, which is why I'm just not super into him. But I do have him right. I have Tylan Wallace and then this player I'm about to say, and then Kadarius Toney. So I'm not far off or anything.
Okay. All right. Who's your guy?
The guy I have here is De'Ami Brown out of North Carolina. So this is another one of those projection type deals where he was just like strictly a vertical threat with North Carolina. I think he showed some nuance with his route running, but it was a lot of just going deep and having that vertical element to his game. PFF charted him at second in deep ball yards, seventh in average depth of target this past year. He had a yards per team attempt rate of 3.08. Again, I mentioned this earlier, yards per team pass attempt is a pretty predictive production metric, but it will skew towards guys who were big play threats, which is exactly what De'Ami Brown was. But the thing with, he had 20 plus yards per reception in each of his last two seasons. So the thing with him is he's at least someone that you can latch onto and say, I know the kind of role that he can play at the NFL level right away. Right. So he's at least going to be able to slot in and be, that field stretcher for a team. But then what if he grows into something more, that's why I think his like max comp or a guy that you could look at is someone like Will Fuller, right? Someone who built on that route tree a little bit more. It's a go-to obviously for anyone who's generally a deep threat. But his production, De'Ami Brown's production profile is really not that bad. He's an early declare as well, has decent age adjusted production. So that's why I have De'Ami ahead of Kadarius Toney, but you run into the issue if De'Ami Brown goes later than expected. Like let's say that he's like a mid third round pick, it might be a little bit difficult post draft to rank him ahead of a guy who went in the first round.
Yeah. Now, so the thing with De'Ami Brown for me, and the reason that I'm not putting him above Toney is I think that his role, as you mentioned, it really was this like stay on one side of the field, run straight down the field. He was able to be very successful doing that. I don't know the level of nuance, quite honestly. Nuance is one of my favorite film watcher route running terminology. But so here's, I know you don't put measurables in there, but there are certain circumstances. I think generally they're overvalued, right? But there are certain circumstances where I do like to look at them. So if you're going to say here, he was basically running like a DK Metcalf, let's say, type of route tree. And then you mentioned Will Fuller as being another guy who it could be somewhat similar to that. I do think when you look at those guys and you're trying to figure out whether or not this purely I'm going to beat you downfield type of thing is going to translate to the NFL. DK obviously he's enormous, but he's also he ran a 4.33. Right. Fuller ran a 4.32, and then Brown he ran a 4.46.
6, yeah.
So not quite there. I mean, he had a great broad jump, great vertical jump. He seems like an explosive guy, good three cone, all of that sort of stuff. But does the long speed, does that affect your evaluation at all, even if it's not part of your official model?
Yeah, it's something. I looked at it with him too. I mean, I would have been really bad if it was like in the 4.5s. I would have been more concerned. 4.46 is still strong. It's still a good, a strong 40. But yeah, I mean, that's definitely part of the concern. That's why it's less of a true comp to a Will Fuller and more of a that's what he could become. And that's also where we're kind of at already with this wide receiver draft class, right? Like it looks strong at the start, but then you realize there's a lot of undersized slot guys, and a lot of those guys are interchangeable. So I'm sort of looking at a De'Ami Brown as someone who's not that, and that elevates him a little bit within the class.
Yeah. Okay. I'm with you on that. Yeah. If you're gonna have, I guess, a missing element, I think fading people who are fixated on athleticism is probably like a good default to do.
Mm-hmm.
So I can get with that. All right, so let's see. We got 10 guys down here. Maybe we'll get a couple more in, and then we'll figure out. So I'm trying to figure out who I want my last guy to be here. I think I'm gonna go with one of these slot guys, even though I'm not necessarily in love with them. But I'm going to go with. All right, so I'm gonna go with Dwayne Eskridge, even though he's not maybe gonna be drafted quite as high there. And the reason being, again, he's not an early declare. He has he's not exactly the youngest guy here. He has pretty incredible metrics for what he's been able to do. So he's been a good prospect from a metrics perspective. He tested pretty well too. So it's almost like you're trying to get a discount of one of the Moors from above. I mean, he's really old, so that's the problem with him. He's like 24 years old now, but he ran a 4.38. He had the explosiveness, the 3-cone, everything else looked pretty good there. He had a 31% target share in his last year, and he had kind of a shortened season before that, so I think that explains maybe staying in a bit there. And he just has kind of all the numbers there. Now, it's not a great player, kind of late breakout, all those sorts of things. But I'm just looking as a guy where, again, if he falls into the right place, maybe he can fill that slot role somewhere. And I'm just going to go with him here versus going with one of these upside, lower floor type of guys at this position.
Yeah, I understand it. I get the allure with him. He's super athletic, which people are probably going to fall in love with. My only concern is that, he didn't do much from a production standpoint until he came back for that super senior season, this past year where he had 8 touchdowns when he had 7 combined throughout the first 4, at Western Michigan. I get it though. Again, we're in a spot in this draft where, there's just question marks all over the place for these guys. And he's someone that if you do look at max season numbers, he's someone that pops because his max season was really strong within the context of, the team that he played for.
Yeah, I mean it's tough. It's like it's not great on here. Maybe I'm looking at the little bit too much of the workout metrics, so that could be a problem there. But I think you can go a lot of different directions here. All right, so why don't you close us out here, and then maybe if you want to throw in one more, if there's a guy that you're in love with as a later round guy, maybe we can throw out one more after that. Not necessarily the next person in your order though.
Yeah, so I'll go with Amon-Ra St. Brown with the next one. The issue I have with him is I don't think there's a ceiling. I don't necessarily see a ceiling for him because if you look at his overall trajectory in college, freshman, he had a decent season. He had 60 catches for 750 yards. Then he had 77 catches for 1,042 yards. And that gave him a pretty good breakout age as well. But then you look at what he saw, what he did this past season. And he really didn't see a major jump when Michael Pittman left that program. And that to me, signals that maybe he's not a true alpha. Everything pretty much stayed the same for, year over year. And the other thing too, we talk about these guys moving to the slot. He actually did the opposite where he was playing more in the slot when Michael Pittman was there. And then this past season, he played less in the slot. He only played 28% of his snaps from the slot this past year, whereas in 2019, it was 89%. And so he hadn't really seen this like really strong trajectory, positive trajectory with his production. And he's actually throughout his every year throughout college, he was never his leading receiver on his team ever. And so that's somewhat of a red flag. That's why I think he's more of a B or a 2 on an NFL team. But I do think that there is some signal there with what he did as a freshman, the strong breakout age. He's an early declare as well, even though I would highly doubt that he goes in the first round. But he was also someone, last year going into this year, people were pretty high on him. And so maybe there's something there. I mean, we've seen that with USC receivers in the past. Remember with Juju, where he saw a decline during his junior season after an incredible sophomore season and having a great breakout age. So maybe there's more there to his profile than what I just talked through, because I basically talked about all the red flags to his profile. But I think he's solid, but he's unlikely to be elite.
Yeah, I can dig that. But then, some guys that'll come up here, I mean, maybe it's leaning a little too heavily on the USC thing, but looking back to a guy, if he can be a second round type of guy, looking back to someone like maybe Robert Woods or something like that, sometimes you don't have to be like elite to fall into the right situation and be a very, very strong producer and a very, very strong fantasy asset. So he's probably the guy that could fall into that category. And I'm all for that there. And then I'm just going to pick out one later guy that I seem to like. So, I mean, I haven't watched a lot of these things here, but when I did an analysis on Ihmir Smith-Marsette, I just really liked what he had done, how he was able to step up in his last year. He's young for having been a senior, and he kind of played on like an awful offense where the passing grade was one of the worst that we've seen there. So that would be just the hope that a slower developing guy who was younger the whole time, despite the fact that he was there for all 4 years with really awful quarterback play, and the fact that he was elite when it comes to the return game. So you're hoping one of these guys, if they're drafted in the 3rd, 4th, maybe even 5th round, if they can stick with the return game, then they can be active on game day, and then maybe they can get a chance to do it on the field. And some people I've seen who are more of the film watching type seem to be into him. So maybe he can even come up on some draft boards as a potential guy who's just like taller and it kind of just needs to develop, I would say, in his game. So I think, again, that special teams aspect, though, I think is overlooked sometimes. Not only does it show you that they have, they're skilled, him being I think he had the best return average on any of his kick returns, and that's like an element of the game that doesn't necessarily show up. That's an additional element, but it helps you stick on rosters. It helps you be active on game day.
Yeah, I'll throw out 2 guys because I think that a lot of people drafting this year are going to be looking for larger wide receivers, guys, because there's just so many small guys. One guy is Nico Collins out of Michigan. He's got the size. He's 6'4". He's like 220. Production profile isn't great. Early declare though. So I think his decent breakout age. It's under 20. If you're looking at 20% dominator. So I think Collins is worth a look. And then last round dart throw. This is just a complete dart throw because, one of the things too, is I found that conference or being a power 5 player as a wide receiver is more important than at running back. Running back doesn't seem to matter nearly as much, or at least what I've tested, but wide receiver does. This guy is not that, but he's fun. It's Michael Strawn, spelled Strachan, out of College of Charleston. But he's 6'5". He weighs 225 pounds. I remember when I first came about him in my, I plugged him into my model and I was DMing with our buddy Rich Rebar. And he was like, Rich was like, dude, you got to watch his tape. And so I go on YouTube and I'm looking at it. Sincerely looks like he is this behemoth of a man playing in high school, because it's basically like high school footage, like all the camera angles are from the end zone and stuff. But his production profile naturally is insane. He has insane athleticism at his size too. So what you're really banking on with someone like that is, yes, he went to this really, really tiny school and likely, his hit rate at the NFL level is not going to be fun. But, if you want to throw out a true dart throw that's strictly based on size and speed, I think Mike Strawn would be the guy to look at.
Yeah, I would have had no clue even how to pronounce that, so I'm glad that
I looked it up. I've looked it up in the past because I try my best to not, because my last name's Zachariason and everyone always says it, wrong and different. So I feel a connection to people with tough to pronounce last names. And so I did that with Michael Strawn. It is Strawn. It's not Strachan, which it sort of looks like.
No, I'm not sure this guy's even in our database now that I'm
probably not. Some of this,
probably from this stuff here. But I'm looking here, 6'5", 226 pounds, 34 1/4 arms, 10-inch hands. Is this like one of these situations where it's like the the
Jazz
cousin who's like
Ferguson.
5 years older than everyone else
Yeah.
playing out there and just like stomping people the entire
Like
time.
it's like Danny Almonte with the Little League World Series all over again. Yeah, I mean he was a man amongst boys at the College of Charleston. But I at least if anyone ever asks that question of who are some dart throw wide receivers, I throw his name out there because if Michael Strawn hits, I will look like a genius.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, so if you happen to be in an 8-round rookie draft and you need someone at the very end, this is your JJ's your guy.
Nico Collins was more reasonable. Nico Collins is a reasonable prospect. Michael Strawn is are you in a very deep league? Go ahead. Why don't you just throw him in?
I'll just to go back to Nico Collins. I think he's another guy where, maybe some team falls in love with them is another thing here as an early declare, as a guy where maybe everyone's like, Harbaugh has no clue what he's doing up in Michigan, and some of these guys will end up going forward. So I definitely like that. All right, my man, we went through it all the picks. I think we agreed for the most part on here. Now, everyone, you sure you're following JJ out there at Late Round Quarterback, the Late Round Podcast. Taking guests now, I've heard recently. So taking guests on the Late Round Podcast. One of the best listens out there. Anything else you want to plug here coming up into draft season?
No, I mean the Late Round Podcast, and then we'll be doing a little live stream draft day over on the FanDuel YouTube channel, where I will be live inputting projections and such when these skill players are chosen. So that should be fun. We did it last year. We do it for day 1 and day 2. So if you want instant projections that are probably going to be incredibly inaccurate, definitely watch that.
Yeah, it's always fun to get a little reaction side on what's going on here. Especially fun from a fantasy football perspective, I feel like, because some of these guys, you're just kind of waiting around a lot of the time that's going on here. So you can get very excited, especially in day 2 and day 3 when these guys start going, as no one cares about where the satellite running back is going in the 3rd or 4th round. That can always be great. Anyway, thanks everyone for tuning in. We'll continue with more draft coverage in the next couple of weeks. And thanks JJ for joining me.